and welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And we apologize for missing last week. Unfortunately, due to the holiday season, we could not be present to make a recording. I know we promised you Jumanji, and we're going to kind of give it to you today, but don't expect much, I guess, is all we can say.
Yeah, sorry, folks. Turns out that when your family hosts the entire family for Christmas, and you are not in your normal space, it's hard to find a place to record, and B, to find the time to go watch Jumanji. So I was not able to hold up my end of the bargain. So truly sorry about that. Sean, you want to fill us in on what happened in Jumanji?
Sure. I mean, let me put it this way: if you've seen the original Jumanji, you are pretty much well equipped for what's going to happen in this movie. You get teleported to the world of Jumanji in this case, as opposed to Jumanji coming out, and you must escape through one way or another. This actually, I think, would have been a really good candidate for the podcast. I'm not meaning to cast aspersions on Jackson's by any means. There was no pressure at getting to go see Jumanji, the last great movie of 2017. So, because it was a video game, it kind of treated death with some reckless abandon, which I thought would have been kind of interesting. It was also surprisingly gory. Like, even in the trailers, you watch Kevin Hart just straight up explode at one point. And that's basically how death is in this game. Like, people just explode or get sucked into themselves with a little poof of blood. It's bizarrely horrifying, honestly. It was a decent enough movie, though. Like, not gonna lie, I enjoyed it. I had more than a couple laughs watching it. I will say that it basically dated itself as soon as it opened its mouth with some references that were old, even by December 2017 standards. So it's trying something. It's definitely a Sony movie, I can tell you that much. They use like the same special effects that they use in every Sony movie. So
was there a lot of product placement for Coke, like in Jack and Jill?
I didn't notice much if there was.
Because that's the other main hallmark of a Sony movie.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually didn't notice much, if any, product placement, to be perfectly honest. I think that might have been the constraints of being trapped in a jungle.
Yeah, you can only make it so egregious, You can only make it so obvious. And I mean, when you're in a video game jungle too, that makes it. I guess they could have had some video game billboards. It could have been like Alan Wake, where you stop in the middle of gameplay to watch a Toyota commercial or whatever the hell it was.
Or Burnout put a billboard up for President Barack Obama in like 2008, I think. That was
one of the Need for Speed games, I thought.
No, Burnout Paradise.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, believe me, that was one that I was like, wait, really? And then spent 2 hours driving around Paradise trying to find. I never did, I should add. Like, I looked for it and I could never find it just because I wanted to see this weird photorealistic man appear in my driving simulator with no people anywhere else in it. That was Jumanji. It was decent. Otherwise, we're going to kind of be doing something a little bit different for this episode. We're not going to be focusing on a single movie today. We're going to be doing a recap of some of our favorite movies, least favorite movies, biggest disappointments for about the next chunk of change. And then the last 20 minutes, we're going to be doing our first annual awards ceremony, which we're going to be calling our Horsies, in which we're going to be giving out spoiler-filled awards to various deaths in the media.
I'm really excited about the Horsies. And also excited to review the year. I am one of those saps who will arbitrarily assign meaning to chunks of time, so I always find it interesting to go back and look at the year, especially with regards to entertainment. Usually I go and make a little list on my Twitter. Some people have been doing that, but since we have this lovely little platform, I figured not to bother, and we'll just talk about it here.
And this year, I think, has been pretty spectacular as far as entertainment goes. There was a lot of remakes of movies and sequels and superhero movies and whatnot, but a lot of them did a lot of work and came out far better than I think anyone was really expecting. And that is looking directly at you, Wonder Woman.
I've heard some people talk about this year as if it wasn't really a good year for movies, and I just don't even know where they're coming from with that, because this year I moved. I moved to a pretty remote location with a movie theater that only has like 8 screens or something. So what that means is that a lot of the more prestige movies don't get shown where I am, and that has impacted our ability to do this podcast on occasion. There were a couple that we both wanted to see and talk about on the show that we never got around to because rural life is a bitch. But despite that, even just mostly seeing like the big blockbusters, this was a fine year for film. There were lots of movies that really stuck with me for one reason or another, and just a lot of others that were a roaring good time. So yeah, I'm not at all disappointed with 2017 as a year for film. As a year for games, I wanted to briefly mention, since we do occasionally talk about games on this show, I'd become sort of disillusioned with video games in the pretty recent years. Had a lot of big disappointments. Just sort of started questioning like whether this hobby that I was really passionate about was really for me. And there were a bunch of high-profile releases this year that both sort of reignited that passion that I had, but also left me sort of disappointed, feeling like they didn't reach their full potential. One of these we talked about on the show, 2 we did not, but they would be Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, and Persona 5. All excellent games with a lot of excellent ideas, but each, in my opinion, for one reason or another, just didn't really meet their full potential. Persona 5 kind of shat itself in the story department about halfway through. Breath of the Wild, again, didn't really deliver on its narrative promise that it had. And Super Mario Odyssey was a great game until you tried to 100% it, which I foolishly did. It's a game where you could just cut a lot of the content and it'd be a better game, a lot of like filler moons. So yeah, there were a couple other smaller releases that I played, but those are the ones that I felt were worth mentioning. For movies, I don't really have a formal like top 5, bottom 5. Like those, despite my qualms with those games, those would be like my favorite video games that I played all year. But for the best movies of the year, I would have to say that Get Out is on a lot of people's lists, and also one that I think deserves more recognition. Came out really early on, but really blew me away. Not just with how smart the script was in terms of like social commentary, but also just being a genuinely tense and surprisingly really funny horror movie. I mean, I know it was directed by Jordan Peele, so maybe it shouldn't be that surprising that it's funny, but it's not the sort of premise that you feel like you could get a lot of comedy out of, and the comedy never really felt out of place either. The tone, he weaved it like in and out really well, and so the funniness never really detracted from the tension in that movie. And yeah, one that came out early on, but a excellent film, worth bringing up again here at the end.
Yeah, I absolutely adored Get Out. I would probably put it in my top 5. We're really kind of trying to focus on like our top 3. So take that as high praise, especially in a year that came out with a lot of movies that would probably pretty easily fit in my top 5 movies of the year. I'm going to take a minute, though, and talk about 3 Billboards Outside Ebbings, Missouri. This was A movie that has some problems. There is no denying that. There is some misplaced morality, some interesting decisions made, but I can't help but feel that I loved it. It was just incredibly raw. The performances were all pretty much incredible. It was such an interesting movie to watch. It was surprisingly funny as well. It was really, really good. And if you get the chance to go see it, go see it. It's in my book a must-see movie in spite of its flaws. And as I said, there are some pretty major flaws, mainly just from a social issue standpoint, and maybe some pacing issues here or there, but I think everything else in the movie more than makes up for it.
Yeah, Three Billboards is one of those movies that I was talking about earlier with where the rural area that I live kept me from seeing it. Funnily enough, apparently it actually did play here, but like a month after it came out and you saw it, and would have been long past the time. And I wasn't even in town while it was in the theater anyways. But you know what I did see that was great, and I'd say worthy of my top 3 that really surprised me, that we did talk about on the show, was Coco, the latest Pixar film. And didn't really have any expectations for this one. Didn't realize that Pixar had another film besides Cars 3 coming out this year, and just didn't really know what to think of it. Just heard that it was going to be a Pixar movie about Day of the Dead. Went in, and it was, I'd say, kind of a return to form for Pixar. Like easily as good as any of the movies that they made in their golden age, if you want to call it, from like Ratatouille, WALL-E, Up, like all those other ones they made earlier, but just on its own being a visually amazing, like well animated film with great characters, really emotional like moments throughout, but especially at the end. Just overall, like a Pixar movie, a kids movie of the highest caliber, I would say, and one that I've still been thinking about ever since I saw it. So should still be playing in theaters right now. So if you have not seen Coco yet, I highly recommend that you do.
Yeah, I'm gonna absolutely jump on the bandwagon and 100% recommend Coco. It's definitely in my top 3 as well. It was absolutely a movie that we went into going, oh, hey, look, it's about the Day of the Dead. This might be interesting for the podcast. Let's see what happens. I was expecting something that would be decent, something relatively enjoyable. What we got was so much more. And if you haven't listened to our Coco episode yet, I came to a realization that may or may not be true based on the pacing of the movie, but I'm going to choose to believe it is because it would just make that movie so much better for me. And that's saying something because that movie is already very, very good. So if you haven't, go watch it. And if you haven't listened to our episode yet, definitely do that as well because it's a good one.
Yeah, it's a personal favorite of mine. Both the movie and the episode, if we want to like pat ourselves on the back. So,
which we do, we're good. And I think probably my last one, and these are in absolutely no particular order because I don't actually know how I would order these, but my last one that I would recommend from the year is probably Blade Runner 2049. I am a pretty big fan of the original Blade Runner. I was not holding out hope for this movie until I saw it was Denis Villeneuve. I probably just butchered his name. But I kind of got some hope there because I trusted him after watching Arrival, which I absolutely loved. And this movie did not disappoint. It kind of toyed with the questions that was left from the first Blade Runner, but never answered them, which was by far my biggest fear with this movie. And honestly presented a lot of new and interesting situations. And I thought it handled it all, especially a movie that did not need a sequel, but got one 30 some years down the road admirably and with a great amount of tact that enabled a fantastic movie.
Blade Runner is probably what I would call my most pleasant surprise of the year, in that despite the director, I still wasn't really expecting much. You know, again, you're watching a sequel to a movie that was made 30 years ago that by no means needed a sequel, but that's maybe perhaps why it ended up being as good as it did, and that it was clearly a passion project. It was going to new places, exploring new ideas. So I wouldn't personally put it in my top 3, probably not my top 5, but definitely very memorable, highly enjoyable film that wowed me in a way that I really wasn't expecting to from the movie. What I would put in my top 3, probably to round it out, would be Baby Driver by Edgar Wright. I saw this movie in like the best possible conditions. I had escaped town and was out on vacation and went to like a really nice theater. And the experience was really good, and it was like a pure cinematic feast. Just as far as like an action movie goes, I mean, we did an episode on this one too, so if you want to go back and listen to that, you should. But basically just for, not so much for having like a super deep narrative or like really resonant themes. More than anything, it was just like a never-ending, like pulse-pounding thrill. And that, coupled with some really great performances, just made it an absolute delight. And another movie that I kept thinking about throughout the year, is something that stood out as pretty special to me.
Seriously, there was no shortage of incredible movies this year, and Baby Driver, the fact that that's not on my top 3 speaks volumes itself of the year, because that movie any other year would have been a runaway hit. Like, I am just blown away by how many good movies came out this year. And I mean, we didn't even get to talk about Logan. Dunkirk was pretty incredible. There was just a ton of movies that did come out this year.
Yeah, one that I want to jump in with that I only didn't include in my top 3 because I saw it so recently. I saw it like last week. So it hasn't had enough time to ruminate. But The Shape of Water was another excellent film that surprised me, that wasn't really on my radar, and came out and really delighted me. Like you said, just plenty of other great films, in addition to even just like some pretty good films. Like, I wouldn't call it like top 5 or top 10 material or anything, but like sometimes I'll think about Spider-Man Homecoming and be like, oh yeah, you know what, that was pretty fun.
Thor Ragnarok was pretty great.
Wonder Woman, of course. The Bye Bye Man, a classic film.
So with the inclusion of Bye Bye Man, I think we should also mention that we are going to be talking about some of our worst movies of this year. Specifically, we're both picking the worst movie we saw this year, as well as our biggest disappointment of the year. Movies that we thought we were going to be very, very good, but just kind of ended up floundering for one reason or another.
The thing about the worst movie, picking the worst movie to keep in mind, is that as far as major releases, I didn't watch a ton of total hot garbage. So it's not like I saw The Snowman or The Book of Henry or a film like that would have just been completely... probably wouldn't have even played where my theater was, to be honest. But there was one film this year that I would classify as hot garbage, and I watched it. If I watched Baby Driver in like perfect conditions, like to make my movie viewing experience its most optimal, this is a movie that I watched in perhaps the worst possible conditions. I am, of course, talking about the live-action Ghost in the Shell. I'm on record as being a big anime fan, but, you know, you might be surprised to hear then that I hadn't actually seen the original Ghost in the Shell before, like Standalone Complex or any of the like other series or manga or whatever. I wasn't like a fan, but what happened was I had a friend who was, and I sat down with her and watched the original because she was really excited to see the new one. So we sat down, we made a day of it. We sat down and watched the original, and then like literally 5 minutes after the credits rolled on the original anime, we hopped in the car and drove to the theater to see the live action version. And man, oh man, did it look ever so bad in comparison. Not just, God, there's just so many awful things about this movie. There's the awful whitewashing, which is bad enough on its face, but is even more hideous once you find out that they have a really stupid in-universe, finger quotes, justification for doing it, and it makes it even more racist. You just have the fact that it doesn't add anything new in terms of visuals. It just looks plain and drab and boring, especially egregious when you consider that Blade Runner came out this year and showed us that you can still make an impressive cyberpunk city that feels familiar but all its own, because that was always going to be the trouble of adapting like an iconic movie that was so influential on like the whole genre. But they didn't do themselves any favors. The whole movie looked like a bland, cheap imitation, and the storyline was just like completely dumbed down. Any and all nuance was removed. Just really like the worst, just emblematic of all the worst aspects of Hollywood films. Just a top to bottom trash fire, made all the more apparent from having watched the source material minutes beforehand.
Yeah, that is one that I thankfully managed to miss. I had not seen the original Ghost in the Shell, and I didn't feel like I should commit to watching this one, having not seen the original. So I skipped it. But you know what else was a bad anime movie this year? Death Note. So this one is kind of tricky because it's not technically like a theatrical release, but it was a giant piece of shit. I am a big Death Note fan. I have been for a long time. It is edgy. It is, an entire male power trip fantasy. It's pretty much garbage. There's some interesting kernels of stuff to it, but overall, it has some problems, to say the least. The movie is a problem. It is incoherent. It is wild. It makes no sense. It is just all over the fucking place. It's funny when it doesn't want to be. It's a joyous ride if you want to get some friends over and drink and watch a bad movie. Otherwise, I cannot recommend staying away from this movie enough. I did not like it. It was you know what? Let me put it this way. Willem Dafoe plays a literal demon, and it's like this creepy CGI demon thing, and like that's all you would need to tell me to sell me on this movie. Like, Willem Dafoe's a demon. All right, I'm there. It did nothing for this movie. He was in it for maybe 3 minutes total, and those 3 minutes do not make up for the remaining 87, 97, however long this fucking thing is. It's not worth it. It was bad.
So, Sean, since Death Note was your worst film of the year, I am now curious about your other dishonorable mention. Since you were a Death Note fan, the other dishonorable mention we have in store, of course, is the most disappointing film. So If it wasn't Death Note, then what was it?
I was really disappointed by Valerian and the Thousand Cities. I am a giant Luc Besson fan. Fifth Element is, a great movie. It's a total cult movie, so it's not for everybody, but I like it a lot. He did Leon the Professional, which is a genuinely fantastic movie. That's one that I really actually like. And he did Valerian and the Thousand Cities, which the first 5 minutes I was going to give the movie a lot of a pass for. Probably the first 20 or so, actually. Because it was interesting. It presented a lot of very interesting ideas. There were some cool things it could do. And then it left its opening scene and became infinitely less interesting. It became this movie that spent the entire time trying to exposit at you. It tried to do so many things. It tried to be kind of wacky and zany, but didn't manage to do either in a cohesive and enjoyable way. Both of the main characters had less than no chemistry with each other. Like, they didn't seem to like each other at all, and they're supposed to love each other by the end of it, and it's about the least believable thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't want to entirely bash it, because I do think there were some very interesting ideas to it, and it's not Death Note bad, it's just disappointing for everything that I was hoping it would be, and everything that the first 15 minutes shows promise of, because it kind of fizzles very fast after that, which is sad.
That is sad. Valerian was a movie that I didn't really have much interest in seeing, mostly because I didn't realize it was the director of The Fifth Element, and when I saw the trailers, it looked a little bit generic to me, like a little bit generic sci-fi, so I ended up giving a pass on it, so I'm glad to hear that it sounds like I didn't miss much.
Nah, can't say you really did.
My most disappointing movie of the year is, in fact, one that we talked about on the show, and it can be none other than Kingsman: The Golden Circle, a movie that I can really only remember because of how much it disappointed me. If you want the full details, of course, go watch that episode, but to summarize, I love Kingsman 1 a whole lot.
As you should, as everyone should.
As everyone should. It's fun, it's funny, it's got a lot of great action, got a lot of memorable set pieces, has a surprising, thematic heft to it. It's got a lot going for it. The first Kingsman the Secret Service. I can't say that, I'm too surprised that the sequel ended up like it did, because I was sort of afraid that they would try to go bigger, they would try to outdo the first one, and all the normal sequel problems. But I still had some hope, just because of how clever the first one was, and how the same crew, the same directors and editors, and they all seem to be back for it. So I had some hope that we'd be getting something more than your average shitty movie sequel. Unfortunately, we did not get that. We got a big bloated mess, full of, shock value for the sake of shock value. There was no, there were themes, but they were undercooked, and it felt really perfunctory and not, and basically really only there because the first one had kind of a social message. Other than that, wasted, some potentially interesting characters, both new and returning, and yeah, just overall, oh, and God, did I mention bloated? I did mention bloated, but specifically, how fucking long it is. It was 3 hours, and that's just excessive for that kind of movie. So, yeah, Kingsman: The Golden Circle, coming in as a really big fan of the first, was a huge step down. So, not the worst movie I saw all year. It wasn't without redeeming qualities, wasn't without fun moments. but it was the one that sticks out in my mind as disappointing.
I would agree with you in basically every regard there. It was not a fun movie like the first one. It just kind of wanted to do everything bigger, better, and did everything smaller and worse. And is only second in disappointment purely because I like Luc Besson as a director a lot. And I keep thinking about all the things that Valerian almost did and getting really sad about it, because there's some really cool stuff that it could have done and just kind of didn't. With that, though, we have gone over our hot and not picks for this year. We're going to segue into our spoiler section, and we're going to be giving out individual awards, or as we call them, the Horsies. We are going to be diving into individual deaths within movies. We're going to kind of talk a little bit about them and award them based on the categories of overwhelming, or as we call them, the person burgers, the hilarious deaths, the saddest deaths, the pointless death, and who we think should have died this year. So there's going to be 5 categories, and we kind of both nominated, for the most part, one. On some of them we already agreed on, so it's just going to be a single nomination.
Well, Sean, you can't reveal our very thorough, very intense vetting process for the Horsies. It's a very secretive voting process.
The Academy helped us out a lot, so
it's a highly advanced democratic process, and not totally just 2 schlubs with microphones talking about movies that they saw this year.
With that, though, we will start discussing our Horsies, and as I said, this is a spoiler-filled category, so
we'll mention the movie first, and then if you haven't seen it, stop.
Well then, Jackson, let's begin, and I'll let you announce the first category.
We'll start with the Bad Horsie Awards. First category is the most excessive death of the year, or as we have taken it to call it, the People Burger Award. And it's called such because of the first winner of this award, which is Julianne Moore's People Burger that she made in Kingsman: The Golden Circle. This is a special death because this was precisely the moment where I knew that Kingsman 2 was not going to be a very good movie. It's a moment early on, in case you haven't seen it, where the main baddie, Julianne Moore, don't even remember her name, but she has a henchman that she's testing to join her drug cartel. And as one of the requirements, the henchman stuffs his partner into a meat grinder, which Julianne Moore then forms into a patty and cooks it, and as part of the initiation makes the other henchman eat it. And this was a real low point of the movie. Not necessarily the lowest point, I would say, but really just as a signal of that the violence in this movie is not going to be used in a particularly clever way. They're not interested in having deaths that play with expectations. Because in the first one, a lot of the deaths are really grotesque and over the top, but there's some kind of point to it. It's all tying back into this theme of where our sympathies lie, and kind of skewering the James Bond figure, both figuratively and literally. So the first one was hyper-violent, but it was hyper-violent for a reason. And the second one just lets us know what's happening right out of the gate by making a people burger and letting you know that, yes, we are just doing this to be excessive. We hope you enjoy. And sorry, Matthew Vaughn, I didn't enjoy. So,
well, along with the Kingsman person burger, I want to talk about the Jumanji person burger, which is my nominee for most excessive of the year. And I know we didn't actually talk about this one very much in the podcast. Specifically, we spoke about it for about 3 minutes at the beginning of this one. But the deaths in this movie are so weirdly aggressive and confusing to me that it felt like it needed to be included. As I said, There is a dude who just straight up blows up in a trailer. People are sucked into themselves and explode in a little blood squib. One person is trampled by rhinos. And all the while, the individuals talk about how they remember everything that occurred and how it went down, the pain they felt as they died. It's weird. It's graphic. And it is so out of place in this movie that feels like it should otherwise be a PG movie. It ends up being PG-13 because they say shit like twice as well. But overall, it feels like this movie should be PG at most. So it's definitely deserving of a Personberger Award because it is something else.
See, you saying that makes me wish we were able to do that episode. Moving on then. Our next category for the first annual Horsies is the funniest death of the year, because we here at Beating a Dead Horse are all about talking about the real shit, but also sometimes we like to point and laugh at people's misery. So, Sean, what was the...
We're sorry. My funniest death goes to Death Note. I guess probably shouldn't be too surprising, especially if you've heard the episode, because one of the characters dies in the most insanely elaborate, bizarre ways possible, in which, because whatever you write in the journal happens, which is supposed to be a thing that is played on and is played very well in the manga and anime and whatnot, and is, used to kind of one-up each other as the story continues. In this case, it's used to make a Ferris wheel collapse, throwing one of the passengers off while the notebook falls into a fire and she falls to her death in the freezing cold water or some shit like that. It is insane, and it is quite honestly hilarious to try and watch and parse out exactly what the fuck just happened. It's absurd. It's 100% wild.
It's interesting that you mentioned Death Note, because earlier you said that the only way anyone should watch this movie is to get a couple buddies together and maybe a couple drinks and like point and laugh at it, which I agree with. This wasn't a category, but Death Note was a thoroughly enjoyable bad movie for me. But I wouldn't say it was the best worst movie I saw all year. That would go to the movie containing my pick for the funniest death, which was the live-action Power Rangers. I thought that Power Rangers was hilarious for a lot of reasons. It attempted to be a serious drama, where the drama came from the fact that the characters couldn't morph. They dropped names like Goldar, who is a giant liquid gold monster, and expected us to take it completely seriously. And just a lot of weird tonal stuff throughout the movie. But nothing in the movie prepared me for a moment that had me screaming in the theater with laughter. I was the only one who was laughing, and I don't even care, because it filled me with so much joy. So at the end of the film, of course, there's a big stupid CGI battle, and our main villain, Rita Repulsa, who, by the way, is amazing. Elizabeth Banks, is that who played her?
I think so. That sounds right.
Yeah. She basically just goes around the whole movie like preening. She turns to the camera and eats a Krispy Kreme at one point in some blatant product placement, and it's terribad and amazing.
Well, yeah, the most important thing in the universe is buried under a Krispy Kreme. Obviously.
I forgot that was the plot point. I only remembered the scene. Anyway, so of course Goldar is defeated. Rita is there. The Power Rangers are in the giant robot, and you have kind of the righteous leader, Red Ranger boy, and he's talking to Rita, and he's like, "Now you've been a bad girl, Rita. Like you lay down your arms and surrender. We're gonna take you to Zordon for justice." And Rita's like, never. And at first I'm thinking that like, oh no, they're gonna like, the Red Ranger is gonna be all like righteous hero boy and like try to capture her and spare her, and like this is gonna be super lame. So then the robot stands up, it winds its hand back, and it just smacks her. It slaps Rita Repulsa, like the small, like, human-sized person, and she goes flying into the sky like Team Rocket. And it ends with, we see a cut of her, like, floating through space, like, limp and dead. And it is amazing. Cannot recommend Power Rangers enough. If you enjoy bad movies, I think it's a great time. But it's like the battle from the last Twilight movie, where it was basically a big DBZ fight. I think that moment alone was worth the price of admission.
I will agree that was a incredible moment, and there were some very, very funny parts to that movie. I don't think it's worth watching, though, to be perfectly honest. I did not get the same, and I went with people who got your level of enjoyment out of this movie. For whatever reason, it did not stick with me in the way that it did with you guys. So I guess your mileage may vary in that case.
Yeah, I there's always a certain amount of risk when you recommend going to see something because it's bad. But if that's you, you know, give it a shot. If it gets too boring, you can turn it off and do something else.
Problem solved. With that, we're going to go into the next Horsey. It's going to be the Pointless Death Award, awarded to someone who died in the movie for pretty much no reason. And this is one that we both agree on.
Yeah, we're gonna dog on Kingsman some more. So part of the premise of Kingsman: The Golden Circle is that the Kingsmen as an establishment have been brought to its knees by the new villain with some bombs and some explosions, leaving just Eggsy and Merlin to sort of put the pieces yet together. You will notice, if you watch Kingsman 1, that in that description, a character is conspicuously absent, and that is, of course, Lancelot, aka Roxy, the successful Kingsman initiate in the last movie, who in the first movie was sort of underwritten and undersold, but had some good chemistry with Eggsy, that this movie, in fact, goes on to develop for like one scene where they have a good little best friend dynamic going on. She's helping Eggsy out with some, like, by using the spy like technology to help him like get through a date, and it's funny and clever and a sign that maybe that something is going to come of her character, that she'll get in on the action, and then she blows up and is promptly fridged, and that whole dynamic, that whole character is just wasted, so we can bring Colin Firth back and undo the most like shocking death of the last movie. So great. Not great at all. It's terrible. Fuck that movie.
Yeah, this was the most egregious thing probably in the entire movie to me, because they basically said, oh, hey, look, we made a really competent female character, one that should be very useful in this movie, one that would be enjoyable to watch, one that, as Jackson was saying, wasn't fully fleshed out in the first movie, but had a lot of room for growth, and it started off like, yes, we're going to make this character shine, and she's going to be great and an incredible, useful help for the rest of the movie, and going to be a star character. And then they just kill her from orbit, and it is disappointing, upsetting, and really, really frustrating, because Roxy is a fantastic character that deserved so much more than she got.
Roxy got robbed. So our next Horsey Award goes to a character who should have died, after all, as we're not just a podcast about characters who did die. We often like to speculate on whether a movie will be improved by a character death, and I think there's arguments to be made here in the year of our Lord 2017. So, Sean, who should have died this year?
That's a tricky question, because in this case, I don't think it's who should have died as much as who should have stayed dead, because fuck Superman. He's terrible. He does not do anything in the DC universe. He is miserable in the new Justice League movie. He just basically is the literal Deus Ex Machina. He's uninteresting. He's boring. He makes every other person in the Justice League pointless, and just get rid of him. Just make it be Superman, and, fuck everybody else. Aquaman could be cool, but nah, Superman can do it better. You know who's faster than the Flash? Superman. So why have the Flash? You don't need him. Put him in his box.
Yeah, the Flash, really only exists so Superman can dunk on him, I kind of realized. Because not only is there the one scene where, Superman sees him in frozen time or whatever, but there's also, even Flash's big, hero moment of, saving the civilians, Superman just does his job better. Flash saves a car, Superman saves a building. And you know what? I like Superman. I was glad to see him done correctly in this movie in terms of his personality, in terms of his actions. It was not worth invalidating the whole team aspect of the movie and making it all about him. As we said in our episode, when people criticize Superman, this is exactly what they're talking about. He just wins. The villain is no threat to him. He's just too overpowered. Really, all the worst aspects of, the classic Superman, and then some baggage, of course, from the previous film, not only undoing any potential weight, the death of Superman as an arc may have had, not that they made good on that anyway, but also just a really bizarre change in character that we're just supposed to sort of accept that he's always been nice and not a dick. So yeah, the resurrection of Superman, a low point in plot points for sure. I do have a example of a character who I think should have died, not necessarily on screen. In fact, I think it would have been better if he weren't mentioned in the movie at all, potentially. It would require some reworking, but I am talking about Deckard from Blade Runner 2049. Harrison Ford wasn't horrible in this movie. He obviously wants to retire. I don't know why he doesn't, but he always seems sort of bored and disinterested in modern movies, but it's not completely distracting in this film. So it's not really anything to do with Harrison Ford. It's more just that I think it's weird that so much of the plot revolves around him. You could have the same plot, the same sort of central mystery, which, in case you haven't seen it, I won't, go in to spoil it too much, but it feels like, in terms of, world building, Deckard is really only involved because he was the main character of the first movie. And not to mention, I think he was the least interesting character in the first movie. I thought the replicants that he was chasing were a much more, that's sort of where the interesting, questions came about. Really, the most interesting thing about Deckard is the whole, is he a replicant or not question, which is not even, something that's more of, a meta thing to, think about the movie than sort of, addressed in the text of the movie itself. So, just, he wasn't the most interesting character to begin with, and I think it's weird that, so much of the plot now revolves around him. The whole, last act does, in fact. And it just doesn't feel like that kind of world. I remember feeling that he was treated in a similar way in the new Blade Runner as Luke Skywalker is in kind of the new Star Wars movies, as being this really important figure to the mythos. And while that makes sense for Luke in Star Wars, because that's sort of the pulpy tone of that universe, the fact that Blade Runner is a little more gritty, a little more realistic, it felt a little weird that basically this space cop is now one of the most important people of this universe. It felt Star Warsy and not a good way to me. So I could have done without Deckard in the new Blade Runner.
And with that, we're going to wrap up with a good horsey. And we're going to talk about what was the saddest death of the year. Jackson, who is your winner of the year?
My winner of the year for saddest death. There were a couple movie deaths this year that affected me. I believe that you're going to be talking about my runner-up, but I really wanted to go with the one that truly had the most impact on me, the one that I kept thinking about, the one that in some ways sold me, not on the movie, because it wasn't a movie, it was a death in a game. And I am, of course, talking about Mipha from The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And I mentioned earlier when I was sort of doing my roundup of briefly what I thought were good games this year that Breath of the Wild was sort of narratively disappointing. And it was, especially with its ending. But the only reason I say that is that the game did such a good job creating this sort of emotional effect and doing it in a really unique way, because this isn't a sad death like you normally think of, where, you know, it's like a sad scene, a character that we've really come to know and love. This game is able to make you feel a really profound sense of melancholy about a character who died 100 years before the game started. Because, you know, Mipha is the princess of the Zoras, like the champion of the Zoras, the fish people. And you go to that kingdom, but the thing about the Zoras in this game that we learn is that they're kind of like elves in other fantasy universes, and that they live for a really long time. And so, you know, she died before the events of the game proper, but in addition to, you know, kind of what the flashbacks you would get, you get the other Zoras who actually were around, who remember you, because, you know, Link is also went into slumber after like 100 years. They remember you, and they remember her, and it still has a really big impact on this community. And none of the other like side characters can really agree on how to deal with you. Like, a lot of the younger ones were your friends, like, back then, and, you know, the older ones are really distrustful of you and bitter. But by using Mipha as sort of the focal point, and just through some good character work in some of the flashbacks, it really gets you to feel not just for her, but just for how this whole community has been affected. And it's not much. It's a pretty small part of the game, relatively speaking. And I think narratively it's the strongest part of the game. But I think the reason why I have to put Mipha as my saddest death, even if I wasn't necessarily in tears over her and it was just more of kind of a melancholy, is that as a Zelda fan, the series, playing them as a kid was sort of a like touchstone in my development as someone who is like passionate about video games and movies and like fiction in general. And you know, a lot of those old games like you know, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, they were really good at using kind of subtle narrative elements, just small little things, to like really pay off in big emotional ways. And it's something that I feel like the series has not been as good at for quite some time now. So to be surprised like this, to feel so much for this fish girl in this community that like had never been previously established, like did not get a big cutscene at the beginning of the game, expanding, really felt like really called back to that feeling like my other favorite Zelda games was sort of able to like create in me. So it's sort of reminded me of why I like the Zelda series in the first place. And just for that reason alone, I think I have to say that Mipha would be my top pick for being a highlight, not just in her game, but in the year as a whole.
I agree, honestly. I think Mipha's death was incredibly effective in everything that it set out to do. She was almost instantly likable, and so watching her, like, you essentially watched her die through the course of the game and the interaction with the people that you were talking to. It presented it in an incredible light and did a lot of really interesting things with this idea of watching someone die from two separate times. It was good, but I think as far as sad deaths go, Logan was better, and I don't mean just Logan in Wolverine. I mean the movie Logan was better. There was so many people who died in such a upsetting way that it stuck with me for a long time. It is just such a fantastic movie. You feel for pretty much everyone in it, and just every person who dies felt like someone that you've known, someone that it's good. It's so good, and it's so sad watching these characters that you love die, and it was treated with such respect and such dignity. I don't think I can adequately express what made this movie so good. It just was so humanizing, and it's good. That's all there is to it. It's so good, and it's so sad, and you gotta watch it.
That last shot of the X-Man.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of movies that I cry at in theater, being a man and all, you can't show weakness. I cried at this one. This one got me. It hit me pretty hard.
I think Logan himself hit me pretty hard too. Like it's really the movie is really something special. It's exactly what it needed to be in terms of being the culmination of this character that we've been following and that Hugh Jackman has been playing for a long time now, like since the first X-Men came out in like 1999, I think. And so that his whole like sort of redemption arc, ending with his death. Beautiful, excellently done. I think the one that got me the hardest was Professor X, actually. Like sweet old Professor X, who just everything went wrong for the poor old fart, and then he, in his last moments, you get this like really sweet confession, and you're just like, you just get your heart ripped out when you realize that like he's not talking to Logan, and he's like, for a minute it looks like he's been like betrayed as he's just stabbed. It's heart-wrenching. So yeah, no, Logan as a film in general is definitely my runner-up, but like, gun to my head, make me pick one, I would say probably Professor X was the most upsetting for me in that film.
I hope you enjoyed our first ever Horsies. They will be back next year, of course, as well as our 2018 recap around the same time. Starting next week, though, we'll actually be back on course with regularly scheduled programming. We'll be doing Shape of Water next week. Jackson did get around to seeing that.
Yes, there is a reason that I didn't want to talk about it too much in the recap. Still got some goodness for you guys. So do your homework, go see it while it's still in theaters, and then come back and we'll have a lovely little discussion about Del Toro's latest.
I've heard nothing but good things, so I'm very excited for this one. Other than that, though, if you want more of our stuff on what's going on, we'll probably be talking about some of our favorite things coming up here on Twitter and whatnot. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can also find me on Twitch every Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday over at twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy.
And I've been Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter over at Jackson J. Keller on Twitter, where I will be talking about the new year and all the joys that 2018 will bring.
If you'd like to keep up to date with the podcast, you can follow us at BADH_cast. As always, we'd like to give a shout out to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. It's on Spotify. You can stream it in any number of places, or you could buy it. It helps them out. You should support them. They're cool people. Thanks for listening.